Hello and welcome. I'm Ann Taylor, contributing editor with IDG and your host for this webinar. Today we'll discuss the use of AI in healthcare and specifically AI-assisted pathology image annotation. Let me introduce our speakers. Nasim Eftekhari is the Director of Applied AI and Data Science at City of Hope, which is a private, not-for-profit clinical research center, hospital, and graduate medical school that focuses on cancer treatment and research. Nasim, welcome.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here.
Patrick Bangert is the Vice President of AI at Samsung SDS America. The company provides software solutions and IT services to clients around the world. Patrick, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
David Niewolny is the Director of Business Development of Healthcare Medical at NVIDIA, which designs and provides GPUs that power all kinds of computing devices. David, welcome.
Thanks. Excited to be here today.
So let's start with how AI is being used in healthcare today. Nasim, could you talk about City of Hope, its mission, and why the organization decided to pursue AI technology?
Sure. City of Hope is a world-renowned research and treatment center for cancer and diabetes. We have more than 35 clinical locations in Southern California, and at the core of our mission is compassionate patient care and innovative research. When it comes to innovative research, we have a lot going on at any given time. Like, for example, in 2019, we had more than 180 million in research grants coming into the organization. At any given time, we have over 300 patents and nearly 30 drugs in the pipeline. And so far, we've been around for more than 100 years, and so far our technology has helped develop a lot of life-saving drugs and therapies for cancer and diabetes, like human synthetic insulin. One of the differentiators for City of Hope in research and innovation is that the time from when we conduct the research from bench to bedside, that's how we call it, is very short. So if we are conducting a research and we see promise in it, we can actually, we have a short path to testing it on our patients and bringing it to life and building treatments and applications based on the research. So AI in healthcare, as you know, has a million applications these days, anything from cybersecurity to clinical trials matching to drug discovery, and a lot more is going on. What my team is focused on at City of Hope, we mainly focus on three domains: clinical decision support, precision medicine, and also operations and finance. In clinical decision support, we have a number of products now live in our hospital, which monitor patients in real time for unwanted complications. So we have these AI predictive models running in the background, monitoring patients 24/7 for things like, for example, infections or surgery complications. And then we are fully integrated with our workflows and our patient care, notifying the nurses and the doctors in real time when a patient is at high risk and prompting them to take action. Precision medicine, as you may know by its name, is personalized care for patients using genomics, imaging, and clinical data. In precision medicine, we work on a lot of exciting research and application problems, things like, why does this therapy work for some patients and not for some other patients with the exact same demographic? Or how do we know which cancer therapy is best suited for this patient based on their disease, their clinical data, their demographics, and also their genomics profile. We also have a team that is focused on improving operations and finance. So we have ongoing projects like cash forecast, like how much revenue is going to be coming in the next week or next day or next month, or predicting if our insurance claims are going to go through and things like that. Today we're going to be talking about some of the challenges in implementing AI in healthcare in general, but also more specifically in oncology. Again, the list of challenges and problems are long, but I'm going to highlight a few of them. Data quality, like every other industry, I think, AI, machine learning, any data-driven solution always starts with good data. So it's important to have good quality data. Again, like every other AI problem, you're working with treating missing data, like entry errors, inconsistent documentation, not so good quality of scanned documents or images and things like that. Another problem, which may be more specific to oncology, is the problem of having small data. So that means we have these diseases are usually rare. And we have maybe in the best cases, in our problems, we have maybe thousands of or tens of thousands of patients that we are looking at. So it's not like other big data problems where you're dealing with like billions of rows of data. We usually have less data than we would want to in terms of number of patients or number of samples. And then we have millions or depending on what features you are looking at, hundreds of millions of features for each patient, like anything from their clinical data, like their laboratory values, the medications they're taking, and this is all longitudinal data. Some of these patients are our patients for like decades. So we have a ton of data, a ton of features for each one patient. And if you add genomics data to the mix, then it goes to millions of features that you can extract just from the gene. And then we have imaging, we have a ton of notes and unstructured data, and all you can do is like extract billions of features from these, from this data, but only for maybe thousands or tens of thousands of patients. So that always comes down to, we have to tackle these problems with some kind of dimension reduction or like synthetic data, things that are actively being studied these days in healthcare and AI. Then there's another problem, like, that all of these amazing tech companies are working on these common data models. Like, for example, if you look at NLP, there are these widely used language models that everybody is having a lot of success with, but these usually don't transfer very well to healthcare data. So when we are looking at taking one of these language models and see if we can, let's say we want to extract the known entities. Our known entities are very specialized, so it doesn't generalize very well. These common models are not usually trained on medical data. And so it's hard to use them. It needs to be retrained. And again, retraining needs data. And then another problem, which is not a problem, but maybe more of a challenge, is in this day and age, is the models that you need to be that you need to use in patient care needs to be explainable. You can't just come up with a black box model, go to the doctors and say, we can make really good predictions that this patient is going to, for example, progress with their cancer, and not be able to explain why. That's not really useful. Even if the predictions are perfect, which they, in 100% of the time, you can make perfect predictions. But even if they are perfect, without explanations, we can't really apply them because they are not actionable. So there's a lot that we do in our team on researching explainable AI and how can we make these models more interpretable and explainable. The last but not least that we will talk more about in this webinar is labeling the data and the human labor that is needed for labeling this data that can then train AI models and machine learning models. As you know, all of these supervised models that we use today have been trained on labeled data. And it's always, I would say, the most expensive part of an AI solution to label the data for training. In every industry, I would imagine it's the case, but that's even more difficult in healthcare because it's not like we are labeling cats versus dogs videos or images, or like asking if this is a car or a red light. These are like very specialized images that we are looking at. Usually non-experts have no idea what a normal cell looks like and what an abnormal cell looks like in case of pathology, for example, or tumors or whatever we are looking at needs expert labeling and annotation. And it's very time consuming and it's very expensive because, you know, these are usually doctors and healthcare professionals that have to annotate these images. Each one of them takes hours and hours of time. And like I can highlight a little bit about what the process is for annotating a pathology image, for example, for AI research or for patient care and diagnosis. Usually a tissue sample is taken from the patient, and then the pathologist makes this tissue into slides, and then each slide is examined either under a microscope or, in case of digital pathology, it's scanned into a very high resolution image. So it's very difficult to feed this whole slide image into a deep learning model, for example, if you are using deep learning to analyze the image, because each of these whole slide images are multiple gigabytes. So what we have to do is we have to break them into tiles, and each slide is usually broken down into thousands of tiles. And again, another complication is it's not like every tile is cancerous. There are parts of the whole slide image that, you know, there are abnormalities going on. So each tile needs to be examined and each tile needs to be labeled. So just imagine thousands of tiles for one slide. And then there can be multiple slides, and this is just for one patient. So imagine if we wanted to annotate or label a data set of thousands of patients, how much manual labor of at least one or more pathologists it would take. So it's technically impossible to annotate millions of pathology images. And that's why these data sets are very rare. So what we did here with Samsung was we wanted to explore the potential of Samsung's active learning system in auto-labeling these images. And there's no question about the value that deep learning brings to auto-labeling pathology images. That has been very deeply studied, I would say, in the recent years. But what we wanted to see here was can active learning components of the system add some value in terms of having the system learn with less manual annotations. So as Patrick will tell you all about active learning and how the system works, but we were really excited to explore this idea of a system that can little by little learn from our pathologists when we are doing a job. In order to do this proof of concept, we looked at a publicly available data set. This is from canine breast cancer data. So what we did was we kind of simulated what it would look like if we wanted to use this active learning system in practice. And canine cancer, breast cancer, is very similar to humans. They use the same grading. So this data set was very suitable and publicly available. That's why we chose this one. And we kind of used Samsung active learning to batch by batch and little by little kind of try to teach the active learning system to be able to get to a point where it can auto-label mitotic or cancerous cells and tiles. So with this, I'm going to hand it over to Patrick so he can tell you about the active learning system and how it works and the exciting results that we were able to get.
Thank you very much, Nasim. Now that we've learned about the use cases in medicine and digital pathology, and particularly with the open data set that we use for the breast cancer mitosis, let me tell you how the active learning system actually works. So the idea ultimately is that not every single image provides the same amount of information to the artificial intelligence training process. And so we would like to sort the image data set in order of that information gain. In other words, we would like to bring up to the front of the queue all the images that provide most of the information. Now, before we start, we don't know what those images are, and therefore there is an interactive process that we call active learning, which initially selects a population of images that is most differentiated from the rest of the data set, gets the human labeling team to label those images first. Those images are then proposed to a learning system that learns what it can from the small amount of data that's been labeled and does not really produce a AI model that we want to use in production yet, but it purports a acquisition function, which is effectively a ranking system that selects the next small batch of images to be labeled. That is then labeled, and again, we improve that active learning model, which chooses the third batch of images to be labeled, and so on and so forth. With every little batch of data that's being labeled, we gain ground truth, which allows us to, on the one hand, further our active learning model, and on the other hand, test its accuracy. Once the accuracy reaches about 85 to 90% or so, the active learning model is good enough to be applied to the entire data set, which then yields labels for every single image in the data set, 85 to 90% of which are correct, which is, of course, not good enough for a clinical case yet, but it is good enough to save human labor in the labeling process, because now we will display to the end user, the labeler, the images with proposed automatically produced labels, again, 90% of which are correct, so that the labeler most of the time can simply say correct, correct, correct as they review these automatically produced labels, and only in 1 out of 10 or so cases would they have to perform a slight adjustment. Now, the adjustment is usually very slight in the sense of a segmentation. And so even there, the reduction in human effort that is put into the labeling process is very much reduced. That's the process of active labeling, and let's see how that turned out in this particular case. Now, in this graph, what you're looking at on the horizontal axis is the number of images that are labeled. In other words, as the batches are labeled, we move to the right in that diagram. So every dot that you see in the picture represents one batch of images being labeled. And we're going up in steps of 2,000 of these tiles that Nasim was talking about. Every batch receives human labeling on 2,000 tiles. The accuracy on the vertical axis, of course, rises as more images are being labeled. And what we're seeing in comparison here is active learning in the blue. That's the rise in accuracy as active learning guides the labeling team in producing their labels. And the red curve is the rise in accuracy if we were to choose images in a random order in order to label the same data set. Now we can see that if we choose active learning as the guiding methodology, we reach the same accuracy far earlier. So by using less labeled images, we can hit a higher accuracy, and that is, of course, what active learning is there to do. So here we lead by the technology to an overall saving of about 90% in human labeling cost, which is basically based on the empirical measurement that it takes about 20 minutes to produce a segmentation label where a human labeler has to draw on the image a boundary line that is not a rectangle and therefore takes some time to draw and identify. But checking that label takes only about 10 seconds or so. So we can lead to a very high reduction in human labeling cost, and that is another 40% improvement over the current state of the art using the kind of active learning that we're using here. The technology is, of course, HIPAA compliant, as is necessary for all medical images to make sure that the security and de-identification of personal information is being met. In addition to that, it's important to mention that deep learning or artificial intelligence for images needs to be backed up by the right kind of technology. And in this case, of course, we are using the GPU, the graphical processing unit, as the enabling technology to do this. And using methodology that runs on a single GPU is generally too slow to support processes like this, because what we're doing here is the labeling team is working throughout the working day for them, and then the active learning needs to do all the machine learning training overnight so that the labeling team can continue the next morning. To make that available, to cut down on these training times, we're using multiple GPUs to do the work overnight, and that requires something that we call distributed training. In other words, the training algorithm has to be distributed across multiple GPUs, and we have a technology in place that allows that to happen in a so-called linear scaling. So if you double the number of GPUs, you cut in half the processing time. And that works very well in practice. So if you need to speed up your machine learning training, your deep learning training, then simply use a larger number of GPUs enabled by this distributed technology, and it will happen. Now, in order to make a system like we're talking about here to correctly identify breast cancer mitosis on these whole slide images, we need to bring together several groups of people, several groups of expertise, and so projects like this are necessarily a team effort. City of Hope, of course, has the expertise in medicine, particularly in cancer, and all the processes that are essential to producing the raw data itself. Samsung SDS brings to the table the active learning expertise in artificial intelligence. We have the data scientists on staff. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to use that raw processing power of the GPU, which is provided by NVIDIA, who, of course, powers not just this method, but virtually every data center in the world, including AWS, which uses NVIDIA GPUs to power their solutions. In particular, the on-premise deployments of GPUs in the so-called DGX stations that are being used both by City of Hope and by Samsung SDS in order to make these happen is an essential partnership that goes three ways. Finally, I want to mention some of the considerations when we want to deploy solutions like this. So far, we've been focusing on training the AI model, in other words, making the model that can be deployed later on. When we do have that model, having labeled and trained all of the systems, we need to, of course, operationalize that for the doctors so that the doctors are able to do all of this. On the one hand, label the images, of course, and later on, actually use it for real patients. So we need to go from the microscopic slide image via the AI system to an actual diagnostic output that can be practically used in a nice workflow. That needs to be integrated with the electronic medical record systems that basically host all of the data for a particular patient, including data like this, but of course vastly more data as well, which needs to be hosted in a way that can be used by physicians to propose an actual practical treatment plan. The models need to be managed in production. One thing that's often encountered is that AI models in production do drift because the distribution of data that was used to make them over time becomes different from the data that is encountered in real life. And so that needs to be monitored, which is called model observation. And then models need to be retrained periodically so that they stay up to date. That whole loop is commonly known as ML operations or ML ops. Lastly, there is a big problem or challenge rather of change management and adoption where we, the AI community, have to work hard at motivating end users such as physicians or hospital management or in fact the patients themselves into utilizing these AI methodologies and trusting them to get it right, which has a lot to do with the explainability concept that was mentioned earlier, where if you put a whole slide image into the AI system and out pops the diagnosis that you have cancer, your first question is likely to be for an explanation of why that is the case. And so these AI methodologies must come up with a human understandable reason as well. And that will largely help with the change management process of getting people to trust these systems. And I will now hand over to David to talk about the NVIDIA GPUs that we've used to make the system.
Perfect. Thank you, Patrick. And thanks both Nasim and Patrick for inviting me here today just to talk a little bit about the GPUs. It's really outstanding to see the use case in digital pathology, how that's being leveraged, how AI is actually being used in practice, and then the way the GPUs are being used in things like AI-assisted annotation and some of the work that Samsung SDS is doing. And what I'm going to share now is really kind of that foundational piece that Patrick alluded to in his portion of the presentation, is that true need for speed. I think in every one of these cases, one of the most important pieces of adoption of AI moving forward, in addition to the explainability, in addition to the data, it's being able to manage the amount of data that I think healthcare is generating in a palatable time frame. I mean, I think just the data that I've seen recently says that 30% of the data generated in the world is healthcare data. So looking at that, you have this deluge of data that then needs to be managed, annotated, models needed to be trained, and that's really what is driving the need for accelerated computing. And that's really where NVIDIA comes in. It's that foundational layer providing accelerated computing that is really going to help in terms of defining that future of AI around both training, development, deployment, and then inference, whether that be in the edge or whether that be in the cloud. And really where NVIDIA plays here is, I think everybody knows and understands GPU, parallel computing, the way that architecture is actually accelerating the entire computing industry. But I think, the other thing that we've learned over the course of the years in technology is that, really tightly integrated hardware and software is important. And that's really what we mean when we talk about an accelerated computing platform. A variety of NVIDIA hardware products combined with an extensive library of software. And that software starts with, low-level drivers, accelerated computing platforms, but then also moves into SDKs, reference applications, and pre-trained models. And a lot of these pre-trained models are getting application specific. You can see some of the models that I shared here on the slide in front of you with AI training, interactive labeling, real-time endoscopy, image reconstruction. And then we even get down into some more, application specific pieces, specifically around medical imaging. So you can really see that, when we talk about an accelerated computing platform, it's not just the hardware, and it's not even just the hardware and the low-level drivers. What NVIDIA is providing to the data science community, the engineering community, and the development community, and eventually the end user, is this foundational platform that it makes it quick and easy to begin your journey in terms of adopting AI. And then the last piece that I definitely want to highlight before talking a little bit about all of the areas NVIDIA plays in the healthcare ecosystem is just the importance of the partner ecosystem. As I mentioned, it's great to hear today from, the likes of Nasim and the work that is being done at City of Hope. And also, looking, throughout our entire ecosystem and the work that Patrick and his team are doing at Samsung SDS and leveraging those GPUs. And I think they mentioned specifically the DGX stations, but also I think another key piece to this ecosystem that needs, really can't, stress enough is this ecosystem does extend from, device to the micro edge, the macro edge, the data center, and then into the cloud. So that partner ecosystem really extends all the way from, medical device manufacturers to hospitals who would actually end up, consuming some of this AI, to research institutions, to a wide variety of ecosystem partners, to cloud vendors and, important cloud vendors like AWS. So from that standpoint, you need the hardware, you need the software, and you need an extensive partner ecosystem. But the foundation of that is the NVIDIA accelerated computing platform. And now if you look at how this actually applies throughout the healthcare ecosystem, you truly can get now a concept of what does device to edge mean and why do you need that accelerated computing platform throughout. And a lot of this, as I mentioned, is focused around that speed of inference. So at the edge, you can see surgical devices, surgical robotics, patient monitors. These are ultra low latency applications where real-time analysis is happening. Think of the likes of, we look at adding, automation to surgical procedures. Think of a day in the future when, we start having surgical robots that begin actually identifying organs and really assisting that surgeon in their journey. And that type of activity is already happening in the medical imaging space. And now you take that inference and think of all the inference that you could do in a hospital room, and now bring that into a single gateway that could be doing inference from all of the devices in a hospital room or all of the devices in a hospital floor. And then think of that back into a hospital data center. NVIDIA has both hardware and software platforms that can deploy across, each of those. And, I do want to stress it's, the training, it's the inference, it's the development of these models, but also the deployment of these models and having solutions. So, again, the short summary is, NVIDIA is really providing this foundation that's removing a lot of the undifferentiated heavy lifting for our data science, our development engineer community that is building these next generation of AI models. And with that, happy to talk more. Look forward to working with all of you more. And I think for now, I'll turn it over to Patrick to give us a quick wrap up on all the great work that we heard here today.
So in order to provide a summary for what we've been talking about, imaging in healthcare is, of course, a very popular application where we try to perform AI to, for example, identify regions of interest in the image to lower the amount of doctor time that's needed to interpret that image. part of that is pre-screening, where we differentiate between the images of a normal section from a not so normal section. In fact, that is already a primary use case because the vast majority of medical images are in fact normal and don't indicate a condition. Then, of course, the AI system works in real time to help diagnose the patients and so provides answers immediately. That shortcuts sometimes the weeks-long time delays between the imaging process and the resulting diagnosis. In creating AI systems for imaging in healthcare, we rely on a large amount of labeled images, and that requires human domain experts, human doctors, to do that labeling, which is, of course, expensive in both the time it takes, the human resources that are required, and the amount of money that we need to pay for it. Active learning is a methodology that's been demonstrated in the study we've illustrated earlier in this webinar to lower that cost in all three dimensions of time, resources, and money by over 90%. That not only makes it possible to diagnose breast cancer in these pathology images, but it also allows a number of diseases to be accessible by AI imaging that were previously just too expensive or not economical to do. So AI is coming more and more into the imaging space in healthcare. Now, in order to do any of this, we of course need several pieces of expertise, and thereby it can only be done by a transdisciplinary effort based on partnerships. We require the raw data and the medical expertise by City of Hope to provide the pathology images and the labeling. We need the active learning system and artificial intelligence systems by Samsung SDS to do the training. And we need the GPUs and the AI hardware from NVIDIA to actually do the computational workload, much of which is hosted on cloud computing infrastructure by Amazon Web Services, AWS, in the cloud. And so by putting all four of these partners together, we can really make this happen and provide a real AI imaging system that in this case diagnoses breast cancer, but could diagnose a plethora of other diseases based on various imaging technologies like MRI, CT, X-ray, ultrasound, and so on. We've put together some resources for you to learn more if you would like to. There is a demonstration video of the active learning technology as applied to medical imaging with some more technical information as well. For the City of Hope, we've provided an overview of their research at the cutting edge of diagnosis for cancer. There are resources available for the NVIDIA GPU cloud where you can find a large number of AI software packages for download, including, of course, the software from Samsung SDS. And finally, you can access a free of charge trial process on AWS. Finally, I would like to invite all of you to try out the technology on your own data set in your own situation to get your feet wet, as it were, in discovering the benefits of active learning for the labeling process in medical imaging. Please feel free to contact any one of us for more information or for collaboration. Please contact me if you would like to try out the technology. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Patrick. Before we wrap up, I'd like to just ask each of you what key takeaway you would most like our listeners to consider. Nasim, let's start with you, and then Patrick and David, if you could follow on, just briefly let us know what you think is the key thing you would like our listeners to consider.
Sure, thank you. I would like to, more than anything else, further highlight the importance of partnerships. Everybody knows healthcare problems are tough. Cancer is probably the toughest unsolved problem in the world, and we can't solve this alone. To outsmart cancer, we have to bring together the best of the best in the world in cancer research, in AI, and other technologies, software and hardware. And in that intersection, that's where I believe magic can happen.
Patrick, what would you add to that?
I certainly agree with Nasim, of course. I would like to add that from a point of view of artificial intelligence, I believe healthcare imaging is the frontier application that we will see in the next 3 to 5 years. So whether you are a hospital, a doctor, or a patient, you will find that artificial intelligence will be increasingly used to interpret images to provide either a second opinion or a first analysis on a diagnosis. And studying the methodologies that are being used to make these systems happen is going to be very good to enable you to have trust in these systems, to understand how they work, and that will ultimately help to cure cancer and to save lives.
David, your final thoughts?
So much great stuff already shared. I think I'm going to kind of piggyback off of what Nasim shared in terms of the ecosystem. I think, that definitely can't be stressed enough. These problems are complex, and you really need to have expertise from a technology standpoint to a clinical standpoint, as well as really just, there's some complexities to the business of healthcare on top of that. So the one thing that I can say from an ecosystem perspective that you need to have kind of everyone speaking the same language and talking together is that foundational platform. That foundational platform that you have the ISV community building off of, foundational platform that you have the research community building off of, the foundational platform that you have the medical device and instrument community building off of. And even, to take that one level further, some of the biopharma and pharmaceutical applications doing their drug discovery building off of. And when you have that standardized platform, which NVIDIA is really working hard to build that platform for healthcare AI and that future of healthcare AI, it's really what allows that ecosystem and those partnerships, because they're all using the same platform, they're all speaking the common language, and they're all using the same foundation. So from that aspect, that's really where NVIDIA is trying to play and kind of be that glue that ties all of these folks together. So looking forward to seeing how we can all change the world.
Wonderful. Well, this has been a great presentation. Thank you so much, Nasim, Patrick, and David, for sharing your insights and your expertise with our audience. I'd also like to thank our listeners. Before you go, please check out the resources section on your console, where you'll find more great information on the topic, including the ability to download the deck with all the links that Patrick referenced, as well as the contact information. On behalf of IDG, City of Hope, Samsung, and NVIDIA, I'm Ann Taylor, and thanks for listening.